I look back now and realize that there were many ways at some of the best moments of my life I was miserable. I was not happy. I was stressed.
He won 4 Emmys, a Golden Globe, for 4 years running. Forbes named him the highest paid actor on American television. By almost every measure Hollywood uses to define success, Jim Parsons had already won. So why, at 53 years old, is he now saying that some of the best years of his career were also some of the most miserable years of his life? Not a rough week, not a hard season, miserable. Through the exact stretch of time the rest of the world assumed he had it all. To understand how a man can stand at the very top of American comedy and still feel like he was drowning, you have to go back decades, long before Sheldon Cooper existed, to a phone call that changed the way Jim Parsons understood time itself. In the summer of 2026, Jim sat down for an episode of the podcast, All Out with John Dean, and said something he had never quite put into words before. Looking back at the peak of The Big Bang Theory, at the trophies and the record ratings and the highest paycheck in television, he admitted plainly that he had not been happy. He described himself as stressed, as constantly bracing for the next thing to go wrong, as someone who felt he was juggling far more responsibility than any one person could actually hold. He didn't call it ambition. He called it something closer to obsession, a compulsive need to control every outcome, built on the belief that nothing good would simply happen to him on its own. If he let go of even one of the plates he was spinning, he was convinced the whole structure would come crashing down. From the outside, that behavior looked like discipline. Producers loved it. Chuck Lorre has said for years that Jim showed up to set more prepared than almost anyone, having memorized his lines before the rest of the cast had even opened their scripts for the table read. It became part of his professional legend, the actor who never let the team down, who treated every single episode like it mattered. What nobody watching from home understood was that this discipline wasn't coming from a place of confidence. It was coming from fear. And Jim has since said that fear cost him something he can't get back: presence. Years of moments with the people he loved most spent only half there, because some part of his mind was always calculating the next risk, always bracing for the plate that was about to drop. That's not a small admission from a man who spent 12 seasons making an entire country laugh. It raises an obvious question. What happens to someone's mind after more than a decade of feeling like they could lose everything at any moment, even while the whole world keeps telling them they've already won? To find the answer, you have to go back to 2001, years before anyone in Hollywood had heard the name Sheldon Cooper. On April 29, 2001, Jim's father, Milton Mickey Parsons, was killed in a car accident. He was 52 years old. Jim was 28, still an unknown actor, still years away from booking the role that would define his career, still auditioning for parts he wouldn't get. His father had spent his life running a plumbing company back home in Houston, and he died alone on the road, found afterward by a passing driver. Jim wouldn't land The Big Bang Theory for another 6 years, which means his father never saw a single second of it. Not the Emmys, not the Golden Globe, not the name recognition that would eventually make his son one of the most famous faces on American television. Jim has spoken about that loss more than once over the years, including on the television special Hollywood Medium, where he was told that nothing could have changed the outcome that day, that faster help wouldn't have saved his father, whatever comfort that offered him. It didn't erase a kind of quiet math he had started running in his head without even realizing it. That math became impossible to ignore by 2018. The Big Bang Theory was still one of the most watched comedies on the planet. Jim was 46 years old, which meant for the first time he was staring at a number that mattered more than any ratings figure. He was exactly 6 years younger than his father had been when he died. So he asked himself the question most people spend their whole lives trying not to think about. If he had 6 years left, was another season of playing Sheldon Cooper really how he wanted to spend any of them? His answer was no. Not because he'd fallen out of love with the character. Because he needed to know what else existed for him before his own clock ran out. He took that decision to the show's producers before he ever discussed it with the castmates he'd spent over a decade standing beside on camera. It reportedly caught several of them off guard, a reminder of just how privately Jim had been carrying that internal countdown the entire time. His father never got a say in how his own story ended. Jim made sure he would have one in his. Walking away from The Big Bang Theory didn't close the book on loss in Jim's life. In 2025, on an entirely different set, grief found him again, in a way that felt almost too strange to be real. Jim had joined the Hulu comedy Mid-Century Modern, a series loosely inspired by the Golden Girls, alongside Nathan Lane, Matt Bomer, and the legendary stage and screen actress Linda Lavin, who played the sharp-witted mother at the center of the show. By every account from the set, Lavin was adored, not just respected, but genuinely loved by the entire cast and crew. Then, on December 29, 2024, with only a handful of episodes left to shoot, Lavin died suddenly following a fast-moving lung cancer diagnosis that had given almost no one time to prepare. The show's creators, Max Muchnick and David Cohen, were left facing an impossible choice: quietly write her character out, recast the role, or confront what had happened head-on. Before she passed, Lavin had already given them her answer. She told the writers directly that whatever happened to her should happen to her character too, that she didn't want them to shy away from the truth. So they didn't. Her character's death was written into the show's storyline, drawing directly from details of Lavin's actual final hours, including a moment where she reached for her husband's hand on the way to the hospital, in case it turned out to be goodbye. The show's creators have since called the experience of writing that episode one of the hardest things they've ever done, and Hulu gave the cast an extra week before asking them to return to the material. Jim was there filming alongside Matt Bomer only weeks after Lavin's real death, acting out a fictional version of grief while still living through the real thing. It's the kind of moment that never makes it into a highlight reel or an award acceptance speech. But by his own account, it stayed with him. It also wasn't the first time Jim had been forced to keep performing while quietly falling apart underneath it. And it speaks to something larger about the nature of his career. The very qualities that made him so reliable to work with, the punctuality, the preparation, the refusal to ever show up anything less than fully ready, were, in his own retelling, symptoms of something much less admirable than professionalism. He has described the mindset almost clinically, saying it functioned like a kind of obsessive-compulsive checklist running constantly in the background of his mind, a list of conditions that had to be satisfied before he could let himself feel even momentarily at ease. Whether that discipline actually produced better work, he says he genuinely doesn't know. What he does know is what it cost him while it was happening. The final season of The Big Bang Theory should have been a victory lap. Instead, Jim has described it as one of the hardest stretches of his life. As filming wound down, one of his dogs was reaching the end of his life, and Jim and his husband, Todd, made the difficult decision to let him go at home rather than risk him dying alone at a vet's office while Jim was at work. Just days later, while the rest of the world was gearing up for months of farewell specials celebrating the end of a beloved show, Jim injured himself on stage. He has since described those days as some of the scariest of his life, saying it felt like standing at the edge of something dark and looking straight down into it. All of this was happening while millions of people were tuning in every week to watch Sheldon Cooper crack jokes about trains and comic books, with absolutely no idea what the man playing him was actually carrying. And it wasn't a one-time lapse in confidence, either. Even years into playing the same character, and even later, performing live on Broadway in front of audiences every night, Jim has said the fear of forgetting his lines never fully left him. By his own admission, he remained, in his words, one of the most nervous people in almost any room he worked in. It's a strange, particular kind of loneliness, being watched by millions of people and still feeling like you can't explain to a single one of them what's actually going on inside your head. Long before Hollywood ever knew his name, Jim had already spent years mastering exactly that skill, hiding what he was going through behind a performance. Just for an entirely different reason. Jim grew up in a Houston suburb, the son of a plumbing company owner and a schoolteacher. He was acting in school plays from first grade all the way through high school, though at one point he actually gave it up for a year, convinced it was too impractical a career, and that he should go finish a business degree instead. It was watching his friends rehearse, and encouragement from Todd Spiewak, who was then his boyfriend, that pulled him back toward acting. The two of them eventually moved to Los Angeles together, so Jim could pursue it seriously. and he went on to earn a master's degree in classical theater at the University of San Diego. But underneath all of that ambition was a fear that had nothing to do with auditions or callbacks. Jim has said he spent years genuinely terrified of being found out as gay, a fear that didn't fade when he became an adult, and didn't fade when he moved to New York to chase an acting career. He's admitted that even the sight of a pride parade used to make him anxious, because he knew there were people around him who held hateful views about exactly who he was. He avoided gay-friendly neighborhoods altogether, choosing to blend into ordinary city blocks rather than risk being noticed for who he actually loved. He and Todd were together for roughly a decade before Jim came out publicly, just days after a Big Bang Theory season finale aired. Jim has said that meeting Todd was the real reason he finally had that conversation with his family, because Todd mattered too much to keep hidden any longer. At the time, he was genuinely afraid the announcement could damage his career, maybe even cost him a show, during an era when leading men on mainstream network sitcoms rarely came out publicly at all. Instead, the opposite happened. Jim has said that becoming part of a community that still faces real hostility gave him a strength he never expected. And, if anything, it helped his career rather than hurting it. Years before that, he and Todd had quietly been recognized at an awards ceremony celebrating them as an inspirational couple, years before marriage was even legally available to them everywhere in the country. Jim has said he never fully understood being framed that way, insisting he never saw his relationship with Todd as any kind of statement, just an ordinary life built on ordinary love. The two married in 2017, after roughly 15 years together, and Jim has described their day-to-day life since as almost deliberately unremarkable, full of the same routines as anyone else's marriage. But even after building that life, and even after finally being honest with the world about who he was, Jim still couldn't fully outrun the thing that had been shaping him since he was 28 years old. Every reflection Jim has offered in 2026 keeps circling back to the same idea: time. He said plainly that there's no amount of money that could convince him to go back to who he was during the biggest years of the Big Bang Theory, the version of himself that was constantly overworking, constantly bracing for failure, constantly convinced that any good thing happening to him was only there because he'd forced it into existence through sheer discipline. It's a strange thing to hear from someone who reached the exact level of success most actors never come close to. 4 Emmys, a Golden Globe, Broadway credit stretching from The Normal Heart, and an act of God to The Boys in the Band, a role he later reprised on screen, plus a Tony nomination years later for Mother Play, and a run in Our Town. What's easy to forget now is how close he came to never getting any of it at all. Before The Big Bang Theory, Jim auditioned for dozens of roles that went nowhere. He even tried out for the American version of The Office, a project he since admitted he privately assumed would flop, since he doubted American audiences would want a remake of a British import, a prediction that turned out to be spectacularly wrong. When he finally read for Sheldon Cooper, something clicked immediately, strongly enough that he skipped a party the night before his audition just to keep working on the material. His first read went so well that Chuck Lorre reportedly assumed it had to be a fluke and brought him back a second time just to be sure. It wasn't a fluke. Ironically, the actor who would go on to play television's most famous fictional physicist actually struggled with science in school himself, something he said had more to do with growing up fascinated by hurricanes in Texas than any real passion for the subject. Years later came Young Sheldon, a spin-off that began as a casual conversation between Jim and Todd about Jim's own nephew, an unusually sharp and different kind of kid. Jim pitched the idea to Chuck Lorre without expecting much to come of it, then spent years directing and executive producing the series that followed. Between 2015 and 2018, Forbes named him the highest-paid actor on American television, a title that made his earlier decade of rejected pilots feel almost unrecognizable in hindsight. And yet, even with the director's credit to his name, Jim has said he still thinks of himself as fundamentally someone who belongs in front of the camera, not behind it. These days, he's on a Broadway stage, nightly starring in the musical Titanic. On paper, it looks like a man who has everything. In his own words, some of his best years were spent quietly falling apart, while everyone around him assumed he was thriving. It's worth remembering, too, that none of this success came from a family with any particular Hollywood pedigree. Jim's mother worked as a schoolteacher, his father ran a plumbing company, and his sister followed their mother into teaching as well. Nothing about his upbringing predicted 4 Emmys or a Golden Globe or a decade as the most recognizable face on American network television. He built all of it himself, audition by audition, rejected pilot by rejected pilot, in a business that has no shortage of talented people who never get the phone call he eventually got. Which may be part of why letting go of any of it, even for his own well-being, felt so genuinely terrifying to him at the time. When you've clawed your way to something that rare, the idea that it could simply be enjoyed rather than defended around the clock doesn't come naturally. It has to be learned, often slowly, and often at a cost that isn't obvious to anyone watching from the outside. At this year's Tony Awards, Jim admitted something few people expected to hear from him, that he sometimes worries fans who remember him as a 34-year-old Sheldon Cooper will be thrown off by how much older he looks now. He started that role at 34. He's 53 today, 1 year older than his own father ever got to be. When that fact was pointed out to him directly during his podcast interview, Jim called it bonus time. Not a passing comment, but something closer to a belief he's actually built his life around. In a strange twist, that same July, right as his most candid interview in years was spreading online, a completely fabricated report claiming Jim had died went viral, racking up close to 1 million reactions before his representatives stepped in to confirm he was alive and well. For a few days, people online were genuinely mourning a man who was, at that very moment, quietly telling the world the opposite, that he finally understood how limited his time actually was, and that he intended to use whatever was left differently than before. He said he no longer has anything left to prove in his career, and that these days he only wants to take on work that actually brings him joy, because nobody, including him, actually knows how much time they have left. Even now, decades into performing, he's admitted he still walks into every single show fighting the same old fear of blanking on his lines in front of a live audience, a nervousness that, by his own account,